Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Jim Campbell and Ed Gruver, authors of Hell with the Lid Off.
Ed Gruver and Jim Campbell are the authors of Hell with the Lid Off, inside the fierce rivalry between the 1970s Oakland Raiders and Pittsburgh Steelers. Jim, why did you write this book?
Well, I really didn't write it. I co-wrote it at best. I think the genesis of it was that I had done a story on Franco's Immaculate Reception for the Lancaster newspaper, and Ed thought that it would be a good idea to expand and get into the rivalry as a whole. At the time, I did not think I could do the whole book by myself, so I suggested that Ed and I collaborate, which I'm glad we did. In many, many ways, I was just along for the ride. Ed did a lot of the nuts and bolts, in fact, most of the nuts and bolts research. I just kind of refreshed my memory of what I remember, what I saw, heard, and whatever. Kind of like I've forgotten the name of the author, but she was a young girl who was in the Battle of Gettysburg, and the title of her book was What I Saw and Heard at Gettysburg. Well, I guess my contribution was what I saw and heard in the rivalry, not only the Immaculate Reception, but other things that took place between 72 and 79. So that's kind of how it got the book started. And Ed and I, he would write a chapter, and I would then write my reminiscences of it. And in some ways, it may have seemed a little redundant, but I think what I did was flesh out the things that Ed was writing about from a personal standpoint. So a long answer to a short question.
Ed, what was it that drew you to this story?
There are a number of factors. I had grown up in the late 60s, early 70s, and the Steelers-Raiders rivalry from 1972 through 1976 really dominated professional football. It's still considered probably the greatest, at least one of the greatest rivalries, not only in professional football, but in all sports. And there are many reasons for that. The number of great players, the great teams on both sides, the coaches, Hall of Fame coaches, Hall of Fame owners, the great games that they had. They transcended football. They were grudge matches to a large degree, and the way they played out, the violence of those games, of course, has been legislated out, but it really did change the way pro football is today. And what we have now with the emphasis on offense is really due largely to what we saw back then with the Steelers and Raiders rivalries. I mean, those games were so physical, so brutal, that the NFL had to do something to change the way the game was being played because of the number of injuries and just because of the pure violence on the football field. But for those of us who watched it at that time, it was great theater, great football, and it's something that, because of the legislation in the NFL now, we'll never see it again.
Now, Jim, you had mentioned kind of how the book is structured, where there was, each chapter has a section that tells the story of it, and then you offer your comments on it. And I kept thinking of you two as announcers, one offering play-by-play and the other doing the color commentating during it. Was that in your mind at all during the book?
I never thought of that until you mentioned it, and I guess if anything, I was the color guy, and hopefully was somewhat colorful in my writing. A lot of it was just bringing back great memories. When Ed mentioned about the number of Hall of Famers, I don't know the precise number, but I think it's over 24. I think each franchise, the Raiders and the Steelers, had at least a dozen or more Hall of Famers, and people like Andy Russell and L.C. Greenwood and a couple of other guys should even be considered, along with some of the Raiders. I must admit that my focus was more on the Steelers, and I will let Ed come up with the Raiders that should be in the Hall of Fame that aren't, if there are any.
Now, Jim, you worked for the Steelers organization. How did you start working there?
Well, that's, again, a long answer. I had always been interested in pro football, even as a kid. I remember in college when players were not eligible as freshmen, you only had a 3-year career. And coaches were not prone to playing sophomores. There was an old saying that for every sophomore in your lineup, it's a game lost. And so unless a guy had a successful, sensational sophomore season, you didn't know much about him until his junior or senior year, and then they were gone. And as a 10-year-old, I thought, gee, I was living outside of Philadelphia at the time. I said, the nice thing about the Eagles, number one, they were winning, and number two, the Tommy Thompsons and the Steve Van Burens, they were going to be around for years and years. So I was drawn to pro football. And I started researching the draft because the NFL did not have any concrete, and there was no publication on the draft or whatever. So I started researching the draft and came up with the first draft, which the NFL said, the only thing we have are names and schools. And they did not guarantee or even suggest that the sequence of which the names were listed was the actual sequence. So I researched that by contacting players, by looking at miles and miles of New York Times microfilm, and came up with the first draft. And it was the way the NFL had it listed, whether they knew it or not, and they didn't. So at first, they would send me a letter and say, gee, the information we have is very sketchy at best, and would not guarantee anything. Then when I fleshed it out for them, they said, can you do the same thing from 1937 to 1942? And I did. And after I had compiled those drafts, I sent the information to the teams that were drafting back then. Many of them didn't have it. So in a way, I was a known quantity. When I got to Pittsburgh in 1970, I went to their offices to see if there was anything part-time I could do. And Ed Kiley, who remembered the fact that I had sent the 36 through 42 drafts, remembered me. It was late in the year. There was nothing then, but they said that come back in the next season, maybe there will be something. So about August of that year, Joe Gordon, who was the public relations director at the time, said you could be a game day assistant. And what I would do, I was on the sidelines with a two-way radio, and I would get the injuries from the trainers, both Steelers and their opponent, and I would also get the specific penalty from usually the head linesman. And this was a time before the referees were mic'd. And the genesis of that was Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, felt that if you were paying $20 for a seat at the stadium, if you can imagine a $20 seat in a stadium, but this was the early 70s, you were entitled to know what the people watching at home on their couch for nothing were. So it was important for me to get the specific information, what the penalty was, who it was called on, and get that to the press box for the PA announcer to relay that information before the next play started. So that was what my assigned duties were. Other things I did was just line the players up for the pregame introductions, and as I said earlier, that was part of my job. It wasn't trying to get on camera. So that's basically how that transpired.
And what was it like to stand on the sidelines during the game? What were you seeing and hearing that, say, a fan in the stands wouldn't?
It was the best seat in the house. It was something. The thing I missed, you did not get the overview that you would get from, say, a press box or a second deck seat. But boy, the sound and the fury you could hear, you were part of it. And you would strike up acquaintances with the players. I remember Ray Mansfield, who was a real character. He was one of my best sideline buddies. And Rocky Blyer, who was still recovering from his Vietnam War injuries, was another one. And I would stand with them. We would watch the game. And sometimes I would offer my commentary to the officials. And one time, I remember it was Tony Viteri, who was a head linesman, and he was the head linesman was the person that was closest to me on the sidelines. And that was the person I got my information from. And I disagreed with the call on the field, and I said something. And Tony looked at me and he said, it's really hard to keep law and order out there on the field. And it's even harder if we're getting heat from the sideline. So I was properly chastened, and I refrained from offering my opinions at the time. But the thing that impressed me was all of those officials were really class individuals. As I said, they could have told me to shut up and get off the sideline, but they were very diplomatic, and they were really great, classy individuals, very professional. And what wasn't known by many people at the time, and I still don't know if it's known, is that in order to be an NFL official, you had to have a job with an outside income of at least $50,000, which doesn't seem like much now, but in the 60s and 70s it was significant. And that was to make sure they were above reproach. And it worked. I mean, you had lawyers, you had doctors, you had school administrators, you had college athletic directors, and just really, really substantial, solid citizens. And it was great to work with those people. And then later, when the officials were mic'd, my job, at least in theory, became obsolete. But the first couple of years, the mics didn't really work that well. So I still needed to be there to get the information and get it upstairs to the PA. But eventually, I was relieved of that job. And if anything, you could say I socialized more on the sidelines and got to know a lot of the players. And the thing that impressed me with the Steelers players at that time, every one of them was a solid citizen. There were no clubhouse lawyers. There were no agitators, nothing like that. They were really great people. And I guess I have to admit that Ed talked about the violence and the really violent and physical play on the field. And I like to think that the Steelers, they were just aggressive players. But the Raiders, they might have been dirty players. And I'm sure if I was working for the Raiders, I would have thought just the opposite. They were aggressive and the Steelers were dirty. But Joe Green, Dwight White, Jack Lambert, all those guys, just hard-nosed, tough players. And it was just a pleasure to be there, to be down on the field, and to witness that close up and personal. It was just an unforgettable experience, and the book illustrates that it really was unforgettable. Nothing pleases me more than to be able to talk about what things were like between the Raiders and the Steelers through the early, mid, late 70s. It was just a time that will never be duplicated, and I'm just so happy that I was a very, very small part of it.
Now, Ed, when did this rivalry begin? Was it a particular game, a particular season?
Yeah.
What was the starting point?
The starting point was 1972, December 23rd. It was a playoff between Oakland and Pittsburgh in Three Rivers Stadium. And, of course, it was a hard-fought game, a very low-scoring game. Pittsburgh led 6-0 going into the fourth quarter. They had a couple of Roy Gerella field goals. And Ken Stabler, who had been replaced by or who did replace Darryl Monica, the Raiders starting quarterback. John Madden had made that call, and Stabler ran 30-odd yards for a touchdown in the fourth quarter to give Oakland a late 7-6 lead, and it came down to Pittsburgh had a 4th and long near midfield, and Terry Bradshaw dropped back to pass, was under pressure, rolled out, just got the ball off before he was hit. The ball went downfield to Frenchie Fuqua, the Steelers halfback, and Fuqua and Jack Tatum, the Raiders safety, collided. The ball, Tatum, and Fuqua all came together at the same time. It still remains a mystery to this day. Who did the ball ricochet off? Was it off Jack Tatum? Was it off Frenchie Fuqua? Because depending on who it hit, at that time, if it hit Fuqua and ricocheted back to Franco, it would have been deemed an illegal play because you couldn't have the ball going from offensive receiver to offensive receiver at that time under the rules. Tatum always claimed that he didn't hit it, that he hit Fuqua, and that the play should have been ruled illegal. The Raiders still believe that to this day. John Madden still believes it to this day. But, regardless, Franco caught the ball off of shoe tops out of the air, ran it in for a touchdown, and became, of course, the Immaculate Reception, and that was the genesis for the Steelers-Raiders rivalry that followed. Now, they met in the playoffs every year from 72 through 76, and 3 straight AFC Championship games from 74 to 76. And each of those AFC Championship games determined not only the AFC champion, but the eventual Super Bowl winner, as Pittsburgh won in 74 and 75, Oakland in 76. But the rivalry grew out of the Immaculate Reception game, Franco's catch and run for the touchdown.
Now, did the players and the coaches, did they feel that there was a rivalry, or was it more of a media-generated thing?
Oh, no, they felt the rivalry, and Jim can attest to this as well. That was, basically a blood feud between the Steelers and the Raiders. Before the Raiders had the rivalry with Pittsburgh, they had rivalries with the Kansas City Chiefs, who were in their division. They had rivalries with the Joe Namath Jets. But nothing really matched what they had with Pittsburgh. And there's really nothing in NFL history, even other great rivalries like the Packers and the Bears, or regional rivalries of that nature. Nothing really compares to what Pittsburgh and Oakland had, because it wasn't really a regional rivalry. They were on opposite coasts. But just a rivalry for supremacy, not only in the American Football Conference, but as it was shown in the Super Bowl, it was the rivalry to determine the best team in pro football.
Jim, were you on the sidelines for the Immaculate Reception game?
You bet I was.
What did you see?
I've made a living off of that. That's really what started Ed and I. Our collaboration was the fact that I had done a story for the Lancaster newspaper on the 40th anniversary of the Immaculate Reception. And Ed said that to this day, Tatum doesn't believe it. John Madden doesn't believe that the ball came off of Tatum. Jim Campbell believes it. And there's a professor from Carnegie Mellon who broke the play down frame by frame, and he believes it. And what I said in the beginning and maintain now, that if you look at the trajectory of the ball, it just flew off of Tatum. It came back like a shot. It was a line drive. It wasn't a pop-up. It wasn't a flutter ball or anything. It really ricocheted. And to me, if the ball had hit Fuqua, it would have continued downfield. It would not have bounced back toward Franco. And something else, Phil Villapiano, who is no shrinking violet, if you've ever seen him on NFL films or any place, he maintains that he was clipped by John McMakin. And if you look at the footage, you can see that McMakin's head is to the front of Villapiano, and it was not a clip or a block in the back. And something else, John Madden says, they didn't know what happened. They went into the dugout and called upstairs to get a ruling from Art McNally, who was the supervisor of officials and who was in attendance at the game. But if you look at the footage, you'll see that Fred Swearingen, who was the referee, signals a touchdown. So there's a lot depending on your viewpoint of what you think about the Immaculate Reception. But I was there firsthand. I remember when Dwight White got dinged on the play before Stabler snaked his way into the end zone. And they put a rookie defensive lineman, Craig Hanneman, in. And he got hooked inside, and Stabler went around the left end and into the end zone for a touchdown. The extra point made it 7-6. And I remember thinking, well, maybe we can run the kickoff back and get a field goal. But the kickoff only went to about the 35-yard line. And then Bradshaw misconnected on the first 3 passes. So it's 4th down, and I'm thinking, oh boy. And I remember standing there with Ray Mansfield, the great storyteller, the old Ranger, and the play occurred, and we both looked at each other and at the same time said, I saw it, but I don't expletive believe it. And then Mansfield, being the raconteur that he was, said, hey, we better get down to the sideline, or down to the end zone and get into the pictures. And somewhere in the vaults of NFL films, you see Mansfield trundling down the sidelines, looking back every 10 yards to see where the cameras are, and then continuing on his way into the sidelines. And it was just bedlam. It was unbelievable. And the thing about it, Joe Gordon, the Steelers publicity director at the time, had given me a locker room pass and told me to go into the Raiders locker room after the game. He said, you don't have to ask any questions, just get some quotes, answers to what the other writers are asking. So I went into the locker room, and it was desolate. Everybody else, all the writers, were over in the Steelers locker room. And I remember Wayne Valley, who was a minority owner, came up to John Madden. Madden was just sitting in front of his locker with his head down, smoking a cigarette. Madden put his hand on Madden, or Valley put his hand on Madden's shoulder and said, John, you deserve better. And after that, there was nothing for me to do, so I left the Raiders locker room, went over to the Steelers locker room, and I told Joe Gordon, I said, Joe, I'm sorry, but I have no quotes. There were none. And he said, that's okay, Jim. I don't think the Raiders are the story this day. So that really was my experience with the Immaculate Reception. And as I said, I did some freelance writing, and I've written several stories about it. And again, it was probably the genesis of To Hell with the Lid Off. So pretty happy that I was a little bit a part of history at that time.
Ed, Art Rooney, Sr., the Pittsburgh Steelers owner, missed the Immaculate Reception. What happened?
He was on his way to the elevator, the stadium elevator, to go down to the Steelers locker room and console his players on, what he and a lot of people thought was a very tough late defeat to the Raiders. So Mr. Rooney was in the elevator when the play occurred. He heard the commotion, and I believe it was a security guard told him that, started congratulating him on the victory. And Mr. Rooney, not having seen the play, didn't quite know what the gentleman was speaking about. And it wasn't until he left the elevator and got down to the locker room that he had learned of Franco's Immaculate Reception.
Now, the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers during this time period that we're talking about was Chuck Noll. When did he first come on board?
Noll was hired for the 1969 season, and at the time he was the defensive coordinator with the Baltimore Colts. And if you recall, in January of '69, the Colts were beaten by the Jets in Super Bowl III, which was probably the biggest upset in pro football up until that time. It was the guaranteed win by Joe Namath. And the rumor was that Clive Rush was the offensive coordinator of the Jets, and as I said, Chuck Noll was the defensive coordinator of the Colts. And the winning coach, or the winning coordinator of the Super Bowl, was probably the prime candidate to be hired by whatever team had a vacancy. And Clive Rush was taken by the New England Patriots, didn't last long, and Chuck Noll was chosen by the Rooney family to head up the Steelers, and he lasted from 1969 into the 80s. So that probably, Chuck Noll was probably as instrumental as anyone in the success of the Steelers. He was just a classy individual, low-keyed, sought no publicity. Whenever opportunities for endorsements or commercials were offered to Noll, he would just say, give it to players, let the players do it. There was one time when Hershey Foods offered him $100,000 just to use his facsimile autograph on Hershey bar wrappers, and he turned that down. And the one thing he did do as a favor to a friend was a commercial for a bank in Pittsburgh, and he just was not comfortable with that and never again did anything that was at least any hinted at anything commercial. He was always let the players do it. He was low key. He kind of seemed to be aloof because he didn't get close to his players. And his philosophy was that if I become their buddy, when it's time for me to cut them, I might not do it. I might keep a guy around a year longer or two than he should be here. And I'd rather not be in that position. But he really cared. I can remember through Joe Gordon, who is a mentor of mine, whether he knows it or not, he asked me to do an article on Chuck Allen for the Steeler program. The writer that was assigned it was covering the Pirates also, and it was the year that the Pirates and the Orioles were in the World Series. It was 1971. And the Pirates upset the apple cart by winning a few more games than they thought. So Ira Miller was not available to write the article, and I did. So I interviewed Chuck Allen, obviously, but also Chuck Noll. And I can remember a few weeks after the article appeared, I was down at a Steeler practice, and Chuck Noll came walking over to me, and I thought, oh boy, what did I do now? And he said, good job on the Chuck Allen article. And it just gave me a feeling that's really hard to describe, because Noll, as good a guy as he was, and he really was a good man, wasn't lavish in his praise of anyone. And another time, as I said, my job was to line up the players for the pregame introductions. And it was late in the season. It was in 1974. It was the year that Stallworth and Swan were rookies. Dave Smith and Ron Shanklin were the starting wide receivers, but they were playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who weren't that good at the time. And they went with Lynn Swan and John Stallworth as opposed to the original starters, Shanklin and Dave Smith. Well, I had known this from the PA announcer, Ray Downey, had told me that, but I was in the runway leading out to the stadium, and Noll and the team had started out on the field, and Noll got a few steps up the runway, and he came back and he said, Jim, you know we're going with the kids at wideout. And I said, yes, Ray Downey told me that. But it was just amazing to me, his attention to detail, that who am I? I mean, very insignificant. And my job was probably even more insignificant. But he wanted to make sure that I knew what players were being lined up for the introductions. Another time, in talking to Andy Russell, who did a great job in writing the foreword of this book, Andy said that when Noll first took over, he met with the players and he said, there's a reason why you guys haven't been winning football games, and the reason is that not many of you are very good, and we're going to have to get rid of a lot of you. And he said that Noll looked at him after watching some film and said, when you line up in this defense, I want you to move a foot further to the outside and an inch back. And Russell was just incredulous. He says, this is really minute. This is minutia at its best. But Russell said he did it and it worked, and he never questioned Noel after that. And that's just the way the players were. There was a motto, I don't know if it was just in my mind or it was really in the minds of the players, but I thought, in Chuck we trust. And they did, and the results were self-evident. They were there. It was amazing. And it was just great to be part of what was going on in those days.
Now, Ed, on the other side of this rivalry was the Oakland Raiders, and of course one of the key personalities there was Al Davis. He started off as a head coach in Oakland before he was an owner. What was his life like?
Very interesting. Al Davis, to piggyback on what Jim was talking about, Al Davis, the head of the Raiders, Chuck Noll, head coach of the Steelers, had a long history together. They had been part of the American Football League with the San Diego Chargers in the 1960s, and had actually both been on the same coaching staff under head coach Sid Gilman on the 1963 Charger team that won the AFL championship, and that a lot of people at that time considered to be the first AFL champion that could really be seriously considered to be a worthy opponent for the NFL champion at that time. In fact, Otto Graham, who the former Cleveland Browns quarterback and later the coach of the Redskins, said that if the Chargers could play the NFL champion Chicago Bears in the Super Bowl that year, now of course Super Bowl didn't start till the end of the 1966 season, but Otto Graham said that if the Chargers could play the Bears in the Super Bowl at that time, San Diego would likely win, which is pretty amazing statement at that time, because most NFL people looked down on the American Football League. They didn't think it was as good, and they didn't think they would have a worthy opponent for the NFL for several years, and that was kind of proven out by the Lombardi Packers in the first two Super Bowls. Al Davis's Oakland Raiders, of course, won the AFL championship in '67. They went 13-1 that year, and they were generally considered to be the best AFL team to that time. And they played the Packers in Super Bowl II in Miami. It was Vince Lombardi's last game as Green Bay head coach. The Packers won rather handily, 33-14. And Al Davis said afterward, the difference isn't between the Packers or between the NFL and the AFL. It's between the Packers and the rest of pro football. But Al Davis was very instrumental in the American Football League. He was very instrumental in the merger. When Al Davis was named commissioner of the American Football League in 1966, his aggressive tactics to sign away some of the NFL's best players, particularly quarterbacks, John Brody of the 49ers, Roman Gabriel of the Rams, and then other players like Paul Hornung, the halfback of the Green Bay Packers. That really helped force the merger between the two warring leagues, because they realized at that time they just couldn't continue to pay out these huge bonuses and these huge salaries, and they couldn't continue to have players jumping from league to league. So Pete Rozelle and Kansas City Chiefs owner and AFL founder Lamar Hunt got together with Tex Schramm of the Dallas Cowboys, and they hammered out a merger agreement that came about in 1970, but was preceded by the 4 AFL-NFL Super Bowls. So Al Davis was very instrumental in bringing about legitimacy not only to the Oakland Raiders organization, but also to the American Football League. And his relationship with Chuck Noll, the fact that they had coached together, is just one of the layers of this whole Steelers-Raiders rivalry. And, it should be mentioned, too, that Al Davis, for all his controversies, was a big fan of Steelers owner Art Rooney. Al may not have gotten along with a lot of other NFL owners, but he genuinely liked and respected Mr. Rooney.
Now, you'd mentioned before the large number of Hall of Fame players on both of these teams. Talk a little bit about the Pittsburgh Steelers and the importance of their scouting department in terms of fighting these players, Jim.
Well, the unsung hero of the Steelers' success was Bill Nunn. He was a sports writer as was his father for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was an African-American newspaper. And each year they picked a All-America team from the historically black colleges. And none knew about these people. And he was not hired by the Steelers by that time. And he would take the information that he had and not necessarily relay it to the Steelers, but to other teams. And he was a person who recommended Deacon Jones, a Hall of Fame defensive end for the Los Angeles Rams, to the Rams. Deacon was playing at Mississippi Valley College, and no one knew that. No one was really looking at what are now known as the historically black colleges, the Gramblings, the Jackson States, Fisk, Alcorn A&M, and the other schools like that. But he also realized that Roosevelt Brown, who was an all-pro Hall of Fame offensive tackle with the Giants from Morgan State, he recommended him to the Giants. So when Noel got to the Steelers, they made Bill Nunn a part-time scout, and then eventually a full-time scout. And he worked the black colleges. He discovered the L.C. Greenwoods, the Dwight Whites, those types of players. And so thorough was he in doing his due diligence that after watching a Grambling ball game on a Saturday afternoon, he would go to the dance that night just to see if the huge offensive, defensive linemen, see if they were nimble on their feet. Because if you talk to any line coach, offense or defense, they will tell you, can he move his feet? Does he bend at the waist? And this is what Nunn was reinforcing with his scouting reports by doing little things like that. And when you think about it, the Steelers' success is really based on attention to detail. Their scouting, their drafting. Jack Butler, who was in charge of Blesto, which is a scouting combine, was based in Pittsburgh. And Jack Butler, his whole premise was to evaluate these guys correctly. He was just bent out of shape as much by the success of a Mike Wagner, who was a low draft choice, as he would have been of a high #1 draft choice that didn't pan out. And I remember him telling me that. He says, we just strive for a true evaluation, whether it's high or low. We want to be right. And Mike Wagner, who was rated pretty low and drafted even lower, turned out to be an all-pro and one of those marginal Steelers that is knocking on the door of the Hall of Fame, but so far hasn't gotten there. Going back to Al Davis, when Ed was talking about him, the Raiders drafted a running quarterback from Susquehanna. I graduated from Susquehanna in '63. Don Green was the quarterback, and he was drafted by the Raiders. He was the 35th player taken in the 1964 draft by the American Football League. And that tells you how thorough their scouting was when you think of what Susquehanna was in those days. And for personal reasons, Don Green left the Raiders training camp after being there for just a week. And 10 years later, when I was working at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the Raiders were in the preseason game, the Hall of Fame game, and I got to meet Al Davis. And I introduced myself. I said, Mr. Davis, I'm Jim Campbell from Susquehanna University. And he stopped in mid-handshake, and he just looked at me and he said, you know, Don Green could have made our team. And it just blew me away. I mean, this is a draft choice that was in the Raider camp for a week 10 years ago. And Al Davis instantaneously recalled that. So tells you a little bit about what Al Davis was all about. And it was just what made the rivalry what it was. It was hell with the lid off. And let me explain that title a little bit. I thought, and many other people thought, that Hell with the Lid Off was a description of Pittsburgh made by Charles Dickens, the English author. But it was made by a Boston writer by the name of James Parton, who was writing in Atlantic Monthly. It was in the January 1868 issue, and with the steel mills booming and the coal mines booming and everything, all the night sky would be lit up by the steel mills, and that was Paxton's description of Pittsburgh, Hell with the Lid Off. And it really was an appropriate title, and I'm glad that Ed selected it. Thank you, Ed.
No problem, Jim.
Ed, let's look at the Oakland Raiders. What was their draft philosophy? How did they end up with so many great players?
Draft philosophy was different than the Steelers. The Steelers would draft for need. The Raiders would draft the best athlete available at that time. A lot of that was due to Al Davis's football philosophy. I've heard it many times on NFL films and elsewhere that the Raiders, they like the horizontal game on offense. They want to stretch you not only vertically across the field with wide running plays, they want to stretch you horizontally with deep running plays. Defense, they favored getting to the quarterback, a lot of pressure on the quarterback. In 1967, they set what was then a pro football record for sacks in a season. And they also favored man-to-man coverage, and they had arguably the best man-to-man cover man at that time, Willie Brown, who Al Davis had traded for from the Denver Broncos. But the Raider approach to the draft under Al Davis and head coach John Madden was to draft the best athletes possible at that time.
Now, you mentioned in the book also that many of these players would sit on the sidelines for several years. Kenny Stabler didn't start for the first 5 seasons. How do players take to that?
They took to it. I guess it would be a case-by-case basis. I know Stabler chafed, backing up Darryl LaMonica for a number of years. But LaMonica was, he was the epitome of the Al Davis philosophy of going deep. He was nicknamed the Mad Bomber for a reason. He liked to take a seven-step drop and heave the ball downfield. He had a rocket launcher for a right arm. Kenny Stabler did not have that kind of arm. He was a southpaw. He was better as a precision passer than Darryl LaMonica was, and he was more accurate on medium range routes. But depending on who you talk to, depending on the players, obviously everyone who's in pro football is there for a reason. They're good enough to play. They want to play. But when they're with a winning organization like the Oakland Raiders, they're willing to bide their time to a degree, as long as they believe they're going to get their chance sooner or later.
Now, Franco Harris was one of the key players on the Steelers during those years. Jim, what made him so important?
Well, he came there as a rookie and just took over. And it's interesting how he got to the Steelers, because Chuck Noll was all set to draft Robert Newhouse, a fullback out of University of Houston, who ended up with the Dallas Cowboys and had a great career. But Artie Rooney Jr., Art Jr., was a scout. He was the chief scout, and he was sold on Franco. Franco was not a practice player, but he was a gamer. When the lights went on, Franco went on. And he kept badgering, I guess is a word you'd use, for Noll to take Franco instead of Newhouse. And again, a testament to Noll, his personality. and his philosophy, and not being a my way or the highway guy, or I'm always right and I'm the head coach and I know what I'm doing. He listened to Artie, and they took Franco, and Franco just burst on the scene like gangbusters. He was unbelievable. I mean, he had more 100-yard rushing games as a rookie, broke Jim Brown's record, and it was just amazing to see him. And he was an interesting character study. He was a loner. He didn't mingle with the players when the defense was out on the field. He just paced, and he had a look in his eye. I remember a game against the Chiefs. Something happened, and it might have been an interception or whatever. And Franco just had that look. He was just pacing. He looked like a Roman gladiator, very handsome. And when he had that look in his eye, and he went out on the field, and I think he broke like a 40-yard run for a touchdown and really won the game. And what was so interesting about what I call the look is I was watching Super Bowl 13 against the Cowboys. It was played in Miami, and I was working in Los Angeles with NFL Properties. And it was a play where I forget exactly what happened, but Franco had the look. You could see it even through the television camera. And he got the ball. He broke off tackle on one of the Steelers' patented trap plays. He used the umpire as a blocker and just roared into the end zone. Again, he had the look. There was nothing that was going to stop Franco on that play. So, and he was the backbone of that offense. I mean, the first two Super Bowls were the defense and the running game, and the last two Super Bowls, 17 and 18, were the ones where Bradshaw made use of Swan and Stallworth in the passing game. But up until that time, for 10 solid years, Franco was a Steeler offense.
Ed, punters don't get a lot of attention, but Ray Guy certainly did. What was unique about him?
Just his ability to, continually pin the opposing offense deep in their own territory and have, make them drive, 70, 80, 90 yards against a very good Raider defense. Jim was mentioning some of the Steelers who should be in the Hall of Fame, and he's absolutely right about that. Some of the Raiders on that defensive unit could also be considered for the Hall. And, one member in particular on the offense was Cliff Branch, who, was one of those speed guys that Al Davis loved, and another guy who was, one of the top athletes in the draft. And, even the Steelers who played against Branch, Mel Blount, Donnie Shell, Hall of Famers in their own right, Joe Green, Lambert, Ham, they all say, if there's anybody who's not in the Hall of Fame who should be in the Hall of Fame, it's Cliff Branch. But to get back to Ray Guy, he was a weapon. He was definitely a weapon for the Raiders. He was a weapon in much the same way that Hank Stram's Kansas City Chiefs had a weapon in a punter named Drell Wilson, who was all AFL and then later all NFL when the leagues merged for a number of years. But Guy was unique in his ability to not only boom kicks, but also to place them. It's one thing to boom a kick, it's another to be able to place it, a coffin corner kick, so it's called, and to make the opposing offense have to drive almost the length of the field time and time again against a very physical, very good, very hard-hitting Raider defense.
Now, you mentioned it a few times in the book, but it's not specifically about the rivalry, but you mentioned the Heidi game. What was that?
That was a game played between the Raiders and the Jets, and that goes back to what I mentioned before about the Raiders having numerous rivals before they had the rivalry with the Steelers in the 70s. But the Heidi game, 1968, it was late in the season. The Jets were visiting the Oakland Coliseum. It was a shootout between two gunslingers at quarterback, Broadway Joe Namath for the Jets and Darryl LaMonica, the Mad Bomber, as I mentioned before, for the Raiders. It turned out to be the Jets' Super Bowl season, and it's one of the most memorable games. I guess one of the most memorable endings that no one ever saw, because the Jets were leading the Raiders late in the game. It was a late afternoon game from Oakland, and the television, NBC, cut away from the game at 7 o'clock to broadcast the children's TV special Heidi. Now, people on the West Coast could still see the game, but everybody on the East Coast couldn't. And in fact, Weeb Ewbank, who was the coach of the New York Jets, his wife called him after the game to congratulate him on the victory, because the Jets were leading late in the game when it was cut away, but the Raiders scored 2 touchdowns in, I think it was less than a minute, to beat New York. I believe the final score is 43-32. And when Weeb got the call from his wife, he's like, what are you talking about? We lost the game. But that Heidi game was instrumental in CBS, NBC, ABC, all the major networks. They made a decision then and there, because of the outcry following the Heidi game, that they would never again cut away from an NFL game until it was completed.
Now, this time period was one characterized by a lot of colorful nicknames for teams and parts of teams. The Electric Company was the offensive line of the Buffalo Bills, because they turned on the juice with O.J. Simpson there. The Purple People Eaters with the Minnesota Vikings, the Orange Crush with the Denver Broncos. Do both of you have, or either of you have, a favorite nickname from that time period?
Well, I think the Steel Curtain was very apt. Those guys were just unbelievable. It was just amazing to watch them. And to hear the fans after, say, a 3 and out, they would come off the field and there was something like, it would be an electric shock or something that you would hear in your ears. I mean, talk about the crowd, the roar of the crowd being deafening. It wasn't deafening in the sense that you couldn't hear. It was all you could hear. And as I said, there were these like wavelengths of electric shocks or something. It was just an unbelievable thing. But I like that as a nickname. I forget who the team was. Might have been the Raiders. They had their secondary, all 4. The cornerbacks and the safeties were all African Americans, and they were known as the Soul Patrol. So it just seems that the media, journalists particularly, had to have a nickname for everybody. So, there were a lot of them, but the ones you mentioned were among the best.
Ed, did you have a favorite nickname from that time period?
I would agree with Jim on the Steel Curtain. It's certainly one of the most memorable nicknames. I mean, you say Steel Curtain nowadays, and people immediately think of, Joe Green and Ernie Holmes and Dwight White, L.C. Greenwood. I mean, you could name all 11 starters on that defense, because unlike the modern NFL, you didn't have players switching out on each and every down. Now the game is so specialized that you have players playing, maybe first down, and then a new batch comes in on second, third, and so on. Back then, with the Steelers and with other teams, the same 11 guys were there, whether it was first and 10 or, third and 20. Ham, Lambert, Shell, Blunt, Andy Russell, they were all on the field for every down, and that allowed you as a viewer, and for Jim as a person who was there on the sidelines and worked with the Steelers, allowed you to really get to know these players, become familiar with their styles of play, and really appreciate just how good they were.
If I could add, the Steeler defense of that time, 10 of the 11 players made a Pro Bowl during that era. And the only one who didn't was Ernie Holmes. And you could make a very strong case that he should have. But there were times where 9, 10, 11 Steelers were going to the Pro Bowl. And that was just kind of unheard of. There were several years in a row when Jack Ham, Jack Lambert, and Andy Russell were the starting linebackers for the AFC in the Pro Bowl. So it was just unbelievable quality of football. Not only the Steelers, but the Raiders and many of the other teams playing in the NFL at the time. I used to think that the 1950s were a great era for the NFL. In fact, when I worked at the Pro Football Hall of Fame in the early 70s, I think 80% of the enshrinees in the Hall of Fame at that time had played at least part of their career in the 50s. But when you get into the more modern era, the 70s, the 80s, and certainly today, the players are just unbelievable. And it's a privilege to watch 3 games on a Sunday, another one on Tuesday, and another one on Monday. So we're really living in a great time as far as sports is concerned, and I truly hope that the country and the sports world gets back to normal, whatever that normal may be, quickly.
Now, we only have just a couple of minutes left. Ed, how did this rivalry come to an end?
Ended in the 1976 AFC Championship game. The Raiders finally broke through. They had lost the previous 2 championships to the Pittsburgh Steelers. They rematched in Oakland in 76. And I should preface that by saying schedule makers really indulge your sense of drama by having the Steelers and Raiders open this season, the regular season that year in Oakland, and the Raiders came back and earned a very dramatic victory in that opener. For the AFC Championship game, 76 Steelers are generally considered one of the best defensive units of all time. Set a record for shutouts, but they went into that game hampered on offense. The entire backfield of Franco Harris and Rocky Bleier were both injured. Neither played in the game. Chuck Noll had to go with a makeshift offense. Long story short, the Raiders won 24-7, and 2 weeks later they dominated the Vikings to win Super Bowl 11. But that was really the end of the Steeler-Raider rivalry. Now, they did continue to play. They met again in the postseason in '83. They did have big games after that, but for all intent and purposes, the Steelers-Raiders rivalry as we knew it basically ended with the 76 AFC Championship game.
Well, we're out of time. We've been speaking with Ed Gruver and Jim Campbell. They are the authors of Hell with the Lid Off, Inside the Fierce Rivalry Between the 1970s Oakland Raiders and Pittsburgh Steelers. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.